Hi, I'm John Stevenson. We're going to be looking at Greek religion in our continuing study of New Testament backgrounds. Remember that because of Alexander the Great, Greece and its culture, its philosophy, but in particular its religion, suddenly was moved throughout the ancient world, not just in Greece, but over the entire Middle East. Greek religion, as this took place, was not exclusivist. They had a multitude of gods, of practices. They were not propagandists. There was no need for them to spread the faith. They didn't actively seek to do that. They were not really ethical either. They were not concerned with doing this or that those right things in order to procure blessings or to avoid wrath. They were not a centralized cult. They didn't have any particular priesthood that had to be in one specific location. There were no sacred texts. They were not experiential or personal. Instead, Greek religion was part of a communal activity. The Greek Pantheon was a collection who had been the offspring of the Titans. The gods, there wasn't one god, there was a whole plethora of them. There was a supreme council of gods. They lived on Mount Olympus in northern Greece. In fact, you can see Olympus on a clear day from Thessaloniki, as it's called today. These gods also lived in temples. And so when you spoke of a temple, that wasn't a meeting place for people. It was the place where the god was housed. They were powerful, but they were not self-existent. They were not omnipotent. They were not omniscient. In fact, they had all sorts of limitations. The Greek gods, the Greek pantheon, were anthropomorphic. By that we mean that they had all of the characteristics of regular people, all the failings, the flawed character. They were not better than anyone else. In fact, you could almost describe them as people behaving badly. And the gods frequently did that sort of thing. We see them quarreling among each other. We see them tricking each other, tricking people. Their sexual immorality was notorious. The heroes, when we speak of heroes, that's a step down from gods. These were semi-divine beings, mortals that had been turned into immortal spirits, either on death or perhaps at birth, having one parent being divine. And so these heroes would aid mortals, they would protect towns, they would do heroic things. People like Theseus and Heracles, we sometimes call him Hercules, two different pronunciations for the same individual, and Perseus. Now, the Greeks also held to what were called daimonion. We translate that normally as demons, and it's taken from the Greek word diomai, which means to divide. And here the idea that these were spirits of unburied dead that would roam around and do various sorts of things. They could make men sick or mad. This idea of demon possession was not just a Jewish concept, it was a Greek concept as well. That these demons, these daimonion, would bring about natural catastrophes. Psalm chapter 96, verse 5 uses that term in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, when it says, for all the gods of the peoples, our English text says, all the gods of the peoples are idols. The Greek text inserts that daimonia to describe that term. All of the gods of the peoples are, we would say, demons, but the Lord made the heavens. Notice by contrast, you've got the gods of the people, they're on one level, and then the Lord, he is on another. The Greeks looked at both what they would call agathodaimonia. Agathos is just the Greek word for good, and then akakodaimonia. Kakos is the word for bad. So you had good demons and you had bad demons. and depended on the demon, just like you have good people and you have bad people, depend on. Now, as we come to the Bible, demons are always going to be seen as bad and evil in the biblical text. Acts chapter 16, verse 16, talks about this idea, a superstition idea. Acts 16:16. It happened as we were going to the place of prayer. This is Paul and his companion Silas. A slave girl having a spirit of divination met us, who was bringing her masters much profit by fortune telling. That term, spirit of divination, not daimonia, but rather a pneuma puthona, a spirit of, literally, we could say a spirit of Python, and certainly that's the term for a snake, although this doesn't mean that she likes snakes or she had snakes around, but the idea here was that she has some sort of spirit that was associated with some sort of worship, and she made her master's profit by fortune telling. Now, religion in the Greek world had a very public nature. What you're looking at here are the ruins of the temple to Apollos. This was in Corinth. In fact, you see the Acrocorinth in the distance. Let's change pictures. The same temple, but notice as I took this photo, we're actually standing in the marketplace of the city. You go in the front door and you have the temple. You come out the back door and now you're in the marketplace. And people would oftentimes bring their sacrifice to the god Apollo. And the priests would take the sacrifice. They would give the god the part that he wanted, and then they take the rest of it for their own meal. And what they couldn't eat, they just walk out the back door and sell it in the marketplace. Temples then were not for the public to come to. Somebody might bring a sacrifice, but he wasn't going to be there and remain in the temple. These were not worship gatherings. Instead, this was the house for the gods, or an individual god. What you're looking at here on the right is a model of the temple of Artemis. Remember, Acts chapter 18 talks about the worship. Acts 18 and 19 talk about the worship of Artemis. It was a place of rituals, a place of sacrifice, because the god was supposed to be there. Of course, you'd have a big statue representing the god or goddess that was there. And so the temple was for the honor of the gods. The sacrifice would be made perhaps to appease them, to curry their favor, to get them to do the thing you wanted to do. And it was all about doing the right ritual, doing the right sacrifice. So you might appease them. You might put a petition for their aid, for their help, get them to act the way you wanted them to act. There were priests, both male and female. The large temples would have a full-time staff that would be 24/7 around the clock. The temples also came to be used as banks because many people would bring offerings, and so that money could be taken and divested, and you could bring money to a temple and then maybe given some sort of just like we have checking accounts and credit cards. Well, you would perhaps take a note from that temple and go to another temple in another part of the world and be able to, for a price, cash your money in and pick it up at another location, which means you wouldn't have to be trying to transport those funds and be subject to robbery. There would be vendors outside buying and selling, oftentimes buying and selling the animals that were there to be sacrificed, again for a marked up price. Acts chapter 19 tells the story of a riot that broke out because Paul had been leading many people to Christ in the city of Ephesus. And we read Acts 19:24, for a man named Demetrius, a silversmith, who made silver shrines of Artemis. And what you're seeing here is a picture of Artemis, the way She is presented in a number of statues in Ephesus. Now you can go to other cities and look at a statue of Artemis. She's very different. So this statue is particular to the way she was presented at Ephesus. Notice you have a number of breasts. This was a sign of her great fertility. There was a man named Demetrius, a silversmith, who made silver shrines for Artemis. He was bringing no little business to the craftsmen, and these he gathered together with workmen of similar trades and said, "Men, you know that our prosperity depends upon this business." He goes on to say, "You see and hear that not only in Ephesus, but in almost all of Asia, this Paul has persuaded and turned away a considerable number of people, saying that gods made with hands are no gods at all." And Christianity was looking at all of the gods of paganism and saying that those aren't gods. There's only one God. He goes on to say, verse 27, "Not only is there danger that this trade of ours fall into disrepute, but also that the temple of the great goddess Artemis be regarded as worthless, and that she whom all of Asia and the world worship will even be dethroned from her magnificence." Now it's interesting that you go to the temple of Artemis today, and this is what you see at the temple of Artemis. There's one column still standing. The rest of the temple has been obliterated. When it rains, it turns into something of a swamp. In dry seasons, it dries up. And the temple is no more. If you want to go to see any portion of the glory of that temple, you actually have to get in a boat and sail up to Istanbul, modern day Istanbul, and go into the Hagia Sophia, and there you'll actually see some of the columns that were taken and removed and used to build a Christian church. So the thing for which Demetrius was afraid actually did come to pass. Now, temples would be the scenes of festivals, of competitions. The magistrates would come here, and the magistrates were actually seen as the guardians of the divine favor, so that the magistrate would make sure that nothing happened to the temple, so that the city would be blessed by the various gods that lived there. And they would be honoring gods through festivals and sports. We think of the Olympic Games, the Isthmus Games in Corinth. These were all in honor to the Greek and pagan gods. So imagine today going to a football game, and the first thing you do is you stand and say not a pledge of allegiance to the flag, but perhaps a pledge of loyalty to the pagan god and give a prayer. There would be grand processions that would climax in the temple with a sacrifice that now would be offered. So this was part of the culture of the city. There would be communal expressions of religion and loyalty, and it didn't matter what you believed as long as you engaged in the outward format. There were domestic expressions of religion. There would be in the home a family altar or a sacred space where the father or mother of the family might go and offer a prayer and some incense and a candle or some sort of fire lighting ceremony that would take place. You actually have some of the gods and goddesses that are connected with the home. Hestia was the goddess of the hearth. Zeus, Herkios, protected fences and boundaries of properties. You have the Agathon daimon, again, the good demon, the good spirit, they might translate it. Remember, the word demon didn't necessarily have, in Greek culture, the negative connotations that it had in the Bible. And the Agatha daimon was depicted as a snake who brought good luck. He wasn't considered a bad thing, was considered a good thing. After all, the snake comes and he's sort of a clean animal and even sheds his skin, leaves a little bit of it behind. And so that was considered sort of a good luck charm. Here we have a picture of the Oracle of Delphi, and we've noted in the past how even kings, before going to war, would go and check the Oracle at Delphi to see, should I go and attack that country? And of course, sometimes the advice that was given was subject to interpretation, and we saw that did not always work out so well. There was a great deal of superstition and magic that would ensure protection and blessing. There was a firm belief by people in the supernatural, in the gods, in the spirits, in the heroes, in the nifs, the individual decay, which is the Greek word for justice, but there was actually a god thought to be named Dike, Justice, who would make sure that all things sort of evened out in the end. But balanced against that was Fortuna, which is, think about having good fortune, luck and chance. And so here's one god that would be making things that balance out. We think of the idea of karma today. And here was another god that, yes, but this other god could get into it. And just by chance, something good might happen, something bad might happen. And so you never could tell what was going to take place. There was protective magic, and there was also imprecatory magic. Now, imprecatory magic is just the opposite of protective. Protective magic is magic to protect you from bad things happening. Imprecatory magic was to make something bad happen to somebody else. And we see some of the superstition in two places we're going to look at in the book of Acts. Acts chapter 8, verses 9 and following, where there was a man named Simon who was formerly practicing magic in the city and astonishing the people of Samaria. Remember, Samaria is located to the north of Jerusalem, a location where you'd have the Samaritans that were sort of a half-breed, part Jewish and part something else. And he'd been claiming to be somebody great, and they all, from smallest to greatest, were giving attention to him, saying this man is what is called the great power of God. And they were giving him attention because he had for a long time astonished them with his magic arts. Did he have real power? Well, we're not told, but he had a reputation for having great power. Verse 18, now when Simon saw that the Spirit was bestowed through the laying on of the apostles' hands, what had happened is Peter, representing the apostles, had come up because there had been preaching and people believing, and he had come and laid hands on people, and suddenly they received the Holy Spirit in some sort of outwardly manifested way. Was it speaking in tongues? Perhaps something along those lines. And he saw this take place, or Peter laid hands on them, and he offered the apostles money, saying, give this authority to me as well, so that everyone on whom I lay my hands may receive the Holy Spirit. He wanted a bit of the action as well. Now, jumping forward, that's some superstition that we saw back in Acts chapter 8. Jumping forward to Acts chapter 28, we see a different sort of superstition taking place. This is where Paul has been on the high seas as a captive. He's being taken to Rome, and the ship gets into a storm and into shipwreck. And notice chapter 28, verse 1, when they had been brought safely through, we found out that the island where they had shipwrecked, was called Malta. The natives showed us extraordinary kindness, for because of the rain that had set in and because of the cold, they kindled a fire and received us all. And so everybody's gathered around the fire because they've been shipwrecked and they're wet and they're soaked and it's cold. Verse 3, but when Paul had gathered a bundle of sticks and laid them on the fire, a viper came out because of the heat and fastened itself on his hand. He suffers from snake bite. And when the natives saw the creature hanging from his hand, they began saying to one another, undoubtedly this man is a murderer, and though he has been saved from the sea, justice, remember the justice, the Greek word there is dike, which is both the word for justice, but it's also the name of this pagan god, sort of the god of justice, the god that makes sure, karma is carried out, that justice is carried out. And notice they see that he's been bitten, and they thought, he must be a bad person, because look what happened to him. And justice, dike, has not allowed him to live. Verse 5, however, he shook the creature off into the fire and suffered no harm, and they were expecting that he was about to swell up or suddenly fall down dead. But after they'd waited a long time and had seen nothing unusual happen to him, they changed their mind. Notice they go from, he must be a bad person, justice didn't allow him to live, and now they began to say that he was a god. And that is how fickle the superstition of the ancient world was. They go from, he must be a bad person, to he must be not just a good person, he must be one of the gods. And This is the world into which Christianity was born, and this is the world that now begins to be impacted by the preaching of the gospel as they are going through a culture and a paradigm shift to let them know you don't have many gods. It's not, sort of fortune and chance and a bunch of competing gods, but rather there is one God who sent his son to die for sins. And you can approach that one God not through ritual, but through faith in the one he sent, faith in his promised Messiah. Now, you also have mystery religions. There were a variety of unrelated cults. They had some common features, a direct communication with the gods. That's what made it sort of mysterious. That was done in secret. Sacred rites that were known only to the initiates. Ceremonial washings, in particular, these were done for Isis, who was one of the objects of this mystery cult. There were special meals, especially with Mithras, meals that, sort of sacred meals that would be taken. There was a baptism in blood to Cybele, and so notice each of these practices was toward a different god. And it's interesting to see how Christianity is not an amalgamation of this, but we actually see a series of ceremonial washings. We see baptism with Christianity and a sacred meal that Jesus instituted, and the idea of baptism, which means that as these things were instituted, they were not completely unknown. In other words, Jesus didn't make up the word baptism. The idea of baptism was already there, and he takes it and he breathes new life and meaning into it. And there were already meals. The Passover meal had been part of the Jewish celebration for over 1,000 years. And yet Jesus takes it and co-opts it and gives it new meaning. This is my body. This is my blood. Now, the mystery religions often had orgies, especially to Dionysius. And Christianity didn't have orgies. They did have a love feast, and the outsider might mistake those, but there were no orgies taking place. There was nothing improper taking place. Instead, it was a meal that the Christians would have together, showing their love and their sharing, not of their bodies, but of their wealth and of their things. They would be sharing their food and their money with each other, because it was not a physical love, but a spiritual love that they showed. Now, regarding the afterlife, there were Homeric tales that talk about life after death, in which Hades, in the Odyssey, Odysseus actually goes to Hades for a time and has a tour through Hades, and it's a place of gloom and shadow. And Achilles says, "I would rather be alive with no fame, no fortune, than to be king of the underworld." Plato actually talks about the idea of reincarnation. So these ideas were around. They made the rounds, and the New Testament speaks in opposition to these ideas. The Elysian fields were supposedly a peaceful repose for the heroes, and then there was the idea, more so among the Romans than among the Greeks, of astral transformation. That is, somebody would perhaps become a star. You see this among the Greeks too, I suppose. When Julius Caesar, for example, died, it was said that there was a comet in the heavens and representing his genius, his ideas, sort of being cast as though a god up into the sky. The Epicureans, by contrast, said, well, no, there is no afterlife. When you're dead, you're just dead. And this became strongly associated with a great deal of Greek thought. So that the Greeks, by the time of the New Testament, very oftentimes had a completely materialistic view of life and of death. Paul speaks to this in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. This is the big resurrection chapter. And he addresses the Corinthians who've been, they've become Christians, but they're beginning to wonder, what about this whole idea of a resurrection from the dead? We don't really believe in that sort of thing, do we? And so he actually challenges them. He says, look, if Christ has preached that he's been raised from the dead, how do some among you say, and some were apparently were whispering or saying this, that there is no resurrection of the dead? He says, he goes on to say, if the dead are not raised, then let us, and he's actually quoting from Ecclesiastes here, let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. It's not just Ecclesiastes, actually. There were pagan philosophers that had said pretty much the same thing. That, look, if this life is all there is, then enjoy this life, because this is the only go around that you get. But he goes on in verse 35, but someone will say, how are the dead raised? And with what kind of body do they come? You fool, that which you sow does not come to life unless it dies, and that which you sow, you do not sow the body which is to be, but a bare grain perhaps of wheat or something else. In other words, you put something in the ground and it grows. And there's coming a day when if you are put into the ground, you're going to grow as well.